Okay, welcome to the second podcast in a series of podcasts from the Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance here at Ziauddin University. And today it's just me on my own. I'm Alex Lawson. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is an issue that's kind of related to the first podcast we did, which was about Ukraine. This is about NATO specifically, because we mentioned NATO in the Ukraine podcast, and it comes up again and again in the news stories about Ukraine. But we don't really address what NATO is, and it's something that, it's a word that's kind of thrown around. NATO has actually become a word in and of itself. Originally, NATO stands for something else. It's what we call an acronym. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But you can actually use NATO itself as a word. If you just say NATO, people know that you mean this thing. But most people don't know what it actually means. And even if you say, well, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that still doesn't actually tell me what it is or what it actually means. That's just substituting one word for several other words. What do those words mean? Now, we're not going to simply focus on a linguistic view of what those words mean. What we're going to do is both focus on the meaning of the words, but also explore the actual history of this organization and what it stands for, why it exists, how it's changed over time, how it's controversial today, and how that feeds into President Putin of Russia's view of the Ukraine issue, the Ukraine crisis. So that's the thing we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about NATO and do a kind of basic understanding of what NATO is. So that's where we're going to start with this question of what is NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And North Atlantic is interesting because North Atlantic is not a precise geographical term. A precise geographical term would be something like Asia is a continent, or America, North America is a continent, and South America is a continent, and Europe is a continent. So is Africa, so is Australasia, so is Antarctica, and I don't think I've missed anybody out. But North Atlantic just seems to be rather vague. There's this thing called the Atlantic Ocean, and then there's these states that exist in the northern part of it. And the answer is yes, that's true, and it kind of was deliberately vague, because NATO includes both the United States and Canada, who are definitely located, in the North Atlantic. They have North Atlantic sea lines, coastlines. But it also includes those states in Europe that may not actually have an Atlantic coastline, but we can loosely describe them as being in the same political sphere as the USA and Canada. And this is sometimes a phrase that's used to describe how a state is leaning politically. If you describe a state as Atlantic leaning, it basically means it's more interested in being friends with the United States than it is with being friends with Russia or China. So it's not a precise term, but essentially it includes the USA, Canada, and then lots of other European states. And although most of the states are European in terms of the members of NATO, by far the most important member state is the United States. The United States, essentially speaking, has as much military capability as all the other states put together in NATO. Which means that it's difficult for NATO to do anything without the United States' approval and active support. There are particular issues around capabilities in particular areas. For example, the United States has by far the world's largest and most extensive military transport and aerial refueling fleet, whereas by comparison Europe has hardly anything, and those are really important when you're taking military action. So it is a mixed kind of organization of the USA, Canada, and then lots of other European states, like all the ones you'd expect, the UK, France, Germany, etc., etc. So it's this kind of strange organization that straddles the Atlantic Ocean. Why was this thing created? Why is there a thing called the North Atlantic Charter? And it was created in 1949. The answer is that the Second World War was over, and although the Second World War had been completed and the Allies, including the United States, Britain, etc., had been victorious, there were a couple of problems. Firstly, one of the states that had been defeated, of course, was Germany. And Germany needed to be reintegrated into European security. You couldn't have Germany simply being the enemy again. And you certainly couldn't do what the victorious powers did to Germany after the First World War, which was punish them a lot. And that led to the Second World War, that grievance, that sense of injustice led to the Second World War. You had to bring them back into a common security environment. And the way to do that was to have a defence pact, where Germany would be part of it and made to feel part of it, but at the same time Germany would never be dominant within it, so it would never be a threat anymore. That was the first reason. The second reason was that although the Second World War was over, the Soviet Union, which had been an ally of Britain and the United States in the Second World War, now became the enemy. It had this huge army that it had built up during World War II, during the Second World War, which had been incredibly successful in eventually smashing the Nazis, destroying Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was largely destroyed by the Soviet Union. Britain played its part, so did the United States, and so did plenty of other states. But something like 3 out of every 5 German soldiers who were killed in World War II were killed by Soviet soldiers. So then they did more than half of the killing, and in the end they were the ones who got to Berlin first and successfully destroyed the Nazis in Berlin and ultimately led to the Allied victory. But the problem is that although in the Second World War Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union had a common enemy in Germany, they didn't really have anything in common after that. They were ideologically very different. The United States and Britain were capitalist democracies, and the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. So when the war ended, it became a kind of, what are we going to do now kind of question. And the answer is we're ideologically opposed, so we're going to potentially get into a new conflict situation. The United States also had built up a large military as well, not as large as the Soviet Union's, but it also built up all these capabilities. And actually, the Soviet Union and the United States came out of the Second World War pretty well. They came out with huge industrial capacity that had been built for building tanks and planes and ships. And that industrial capacity could now be turned to building merchant ships instead of warships, and cars and tractors instead of tanks. And they could carry on building aeroplanes, but they were now airliners, not bombers. So you've got this situation where the former allies are now enemies. And what NATO did was to say, if you are not in the ideological orbit, as we say, if you're not within the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and you're worried about the Soviet Union threatening you, then you can join NATO. The Soviet Union, after the Second World War, effectively took over a lot of states in Eastern Europe. In states like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, the eastern part of Germany, it dominated them, it turned them into communist dictatorships like itself, and although they were notionally independent states, they were not. If you were the president of Poland in 1955, you couldn't do anything unless the Soviet Union approved it. Right? You certainly couldn't make any agreements with other states or do anything like that. You couldn't change your constitution, you couldn't hold elections or anything like that. The Soviet Union told you what to do. So there was this Soviet bloc on one side, and on the western side, states like France, Italy, the western part of Germany, the UK, and then the USA and Canada were opposed to communism, and they formed NATO. They formed a common treaty organization, and this was the North Atlantic Charter, or the North Atlantic Treaty as it's sometimes called, of 1949. So NATO was set up as a defensive alliance. Now, we need to do a little bit of international law discussion here in a general sense. So we're going to talk about how regional alliances like NATO fit in with the United Nations Charter. If you're interested in the use of force in international law, which I think you should be because it's relevant all the time. Only yesterday in dawn I read of tensions on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. You'll be reading about this as well. So this kind of thing is contemporary, and it matters, as well as obviously the Ukraine crisis. But if you go and look in your United Nations Charter, you only have to look very early on. Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. So we're not talking about the NATO treaty or charter, we're talking about the UN one. And remember, the UN Charter is all the states of the world. So if you're a member of NATO, you are also a member of the United Nations. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force, blah, 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 or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. In other words, you can't use force in international law, in international relations. Using force in international relations is illegal, it's a breach of the law. Now, you might look at that and go, hooray! Well done, United Nations. Then you might also look at it and go, but hang on, this is the United Nations Charter. This was roughly the same time as NATO was created. And there have been quite a lot of wars since then. And there are quite a lot of wars going on even as we speak. In other words, this has not been that successful. And the answer is that there is a prohibition, but it has been breached. So we need to look a little bit more at the UN Charter, and then we'll talk about how that all works when we put it together. Because although Article 2.4 says there should be no use of force in international relations, what Article 2.4 is really saying is there should be no aggressive use of force in international relations. It's fine if you use force defensively. Now, straight away you can see the problem, which is that if everybody's using force defensively, well, that wouldn't make sense. There have to be some aggressors, some people using it, some states using it defensively. And that's kind of the answer you get, that if you have a situation where one state attacks another, then the state that attacks the other one is breaching Article 2.4. But the state that then responds in self-defense is justified in acting in self-defense. And this is Article 51 of the United Nations Charter that says every state has a right to individual and collective self-defense. So, although it kind of looks bad that there have been all these wars, hundreds of wars since 1945, in a lot of those cases, only one side was actually guilty of doing anything wrong, because the other side was simply acting in self-defense. Right? But the UN Charter seems to be quite clear in saying that there should be no aggressive use of force, but there is self-defense allowed if you add in Article 51. You also then might want to look at Article 42 of the UN Charter. This is the measure that allows the United Nations Security Council to justify the use of force by passing a resolution to that effect. And this is why you often hear about a meeting of the Security Council and a resolution of the Security Council. Basically, Article 42 of the UN Charter allows the Security Council to declare legal a use of force. And essentially speaking, for our purposes today anyway, whatever the Security Council says is lawful is lawful. So if the Security Council authorises a member state to use force against another, or more likely a coalition of member states to use force against another, then it is lawful. Right? And then the last bit of the UN Charter that's really kind of specific to this is that Article 52 of the Charter says that member states of the UN can create regional arrangements for dealing with peace and security, as long as they are consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN. So in other words, Article 52 is where we specifically see an allowance for something like NATO, that there can be a regional organisation like NATO. NATO is a regional organisation. The fact that it's constantly expanding is neither here nor there. I mean, it is basically a European and North Atlantic organisation. There's, Australia can't join NATO. Australia has very similar security interests to NATO member states, it basically has the same concerns and the same ideology, but Australia can't join NATO, it's not in the North Atlantic. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here with all of this is that international law does allow for something like NATO, but we'll return to some of these themes later on, because the way NATO has developed has been inconsistent with some of these UN rules. So NATO is therefore what we describe as a defensive alliance. The idea of NATO, the cornerstone of NATO, is Article 5, and now we're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty, not the United Nations Charter. The North Atlantic Treaty, the Treaty of NATO itself, says in Article 5 that an attack on one member state shall be considered an attack on all member states if NATO so declares it, right? Because obviously, there might be circumstances where, for example, if somebody blows themselves up in a bombing in Paris and kills 5 civilians, it's unlikely that NATO would regard that as an attack on one of its member states, and therefore as an attack on all of the member states. They would simply regard that as a terrorism, security, law and order issue. But where there is a direct armed attack on a member state, NATO could invoke Article 5. And it did, for example, after the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001. They were sufficiently large scale that NATO declared that to be an attack on all of its members, which meant that it could then exercise collective security solidarity with the United States. To be honest, it was largely a gesture. It was a way of saying to the United States that NATO's other member states are with you and we sympathize and we would like to help as much as we can. It didn't really help in terms of, the United States already had the capability to militarily respond. But secondly, it's difficult to see, what exactly that declaration did in terms of mobilizing the other member states to act. It didn't. And you could also make an argument that simply says that a terrorist attack is not really what the people who drafted the NATO Charter were thinking about. But we'll return to this again later. So NATO was created to deal with the security situation at the end of the Second World War, and NATO was a defensive alliance. The idea was that there was always this sort of nagging fear, and I can tell you that this is true because I was alive at this time. This was during what we call the Cold War, and there was this nagging fear that the Cold War, which was this competition in world affairs between the West and the East, between NATO and other allied states and the Eastern Bloc, this Cold War competition in which they didn't fight directly, but they did fight in different parts of the world, and sometimes, for example, conflicts between India and Pakistan became conflicts in which the East and the West were involved because they supplied arms to one side or to the other. So, for example, in the 1970s, the West would supply airplanes to Pakistan, and the Soviet Union would supply airplanes to India, and that meant that when they fought in their occasional conflicts, they became kind of what we call proxy wars, in which the East and the West didn't fight directly, but they fought through smaller regional conflicts. But there's always this fear that eventually the Soviet Union might just decide to invade Western Europe, finish the job and get all of Europe instead of having half of it. And of course, nuclear weapons were mixed up in this, and there was the fear that this would be World War III and the end of civilization. And NATO was there as a kind of a deterrent to say to the Soviet Union that if you attack even one of the member states, all these member states will be able to respond. There's this thing in military planning called salami tactics, and salami refers to a sausage, and the idea is that nobody eats a whole salami in one go because they're massive and you burst. What you do with a salami sausage is you slice it into little pieces and then you eat a piece. And so salami tactics was the idea that rather than rolling all of your tanks through Western Europe and heading for Paris, you would pick on a very small member state and you would take a little bit of it. For example, you might decide that a bit of what was West Germany is your target, and you would conquer a little tiny piece of it. And what that would mean is the West would not be in a position to say, well, let's just fire all our nuclear weapons, because it would seem ridiculous to do that over a tiny little piece of territory. But over time, those tiny little pieces of territory, those tiny little cuts, would eventually lead to substantial territorial conquest. And it was a way of testing the resolve of the West as well. So the idea of NATO is to say, no, you can't do that. An attack, however insignificant and small, on one member state is attacking all of us, and we will respond. Now, of course, you might say, this is all rather one-sided, because you've got NATO, and so far I've just been referring to the Eastern Bloc in a very vague way. And that's because the Eastern Bloc Security Pact didn't come along until a little bit later. 6 years later, in 1955, the Soviet Union and other Eastern European states that were within its control basically created what is commonly known as the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw is the capital of Poland, and that's where the pact was signed. And the Warsaw Pact was the counterpart to NATO. It was the idea that the armies and navies and air forces of the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe would act together in the way that NATO would act together. So whereas NATO was France, Italy, United Kingdom, USA, the Warsaw Pact was Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The Warsaw Pact was really symbolic because in NATO, if you wanted to join NATO, you had a choice. And you could choose to join NATO or choose not to. And so, for example, Norway chose to join NATO, but Sweden never did. And that's due to their political history. Whereas in the Warsaw Pact, you really didn't have a choice. You were already in the control of the Soviet Union. And the Warsaw Pact was really symbolic. It was already assumed that if there was a war in Europe, the Soviet Union would control your military and tell them where to go and what to do. So the Warsaw Pact was a kind of just a symbolic way of pretending that there was something like NATO. You didn't have a choice in being a member of the Warsaw Pact. So anyway, these were the two entities that we created, and the Cold War rumbled along. There was no conflicts in Europe during the Cold War. It was a Cold War. There were plenty of hot war conflicts around the world. As I mentioned, some of the ones between India and Pakistan could be described as being parts of this. There were conflicts in Africa. There were conflicts, particularly in Southeast Asia, in places like Vietnam, also Korea, where the conflicts were backed by the West and the East, by what is basically the Warsaw Pact and the NATO countries, but they didn't fight directly, which would have been, potentially much more dangerous. The Arab-Israeli conflict can be seen in this way as well, because the Israelis were obviously backed by the United States and the West, and the Arab states, for a certain period of time, until at least the 1980s, were backed by the Soviet Union. So even something like Kashmir, became an ideological dividing point. And I think this is one of the legacies we have to learn, is that when you're dealing with conflicts that have been going on for a long period of time, those conflicts have maybe lasted longer than some of the political events that influence them. What I'm getting at is this. During the Cold War, everything was viewed through the lens, through the prism of the Cold War. So if you were the NATO states, you supported anybody who opposed the Soviet Union and its allies in the Warsaw Pact. And it was the same the other way around. If you were the Soviet Union, you supported anybody who opposed your enemy. My enemy's enemy is my friend. The problem is that meant that you ended up on the wrong side of some conflicts. So, for example, the West would supplied, South Vietnam in the Vietnam War, and in the case of the Americans, they actually fought in the Vietnam War. And they saw it as a struggle between communism and capitalism, between the Soviet Union and the United States, NATO, and its other allies. But if you actually were a Vietnamese national, for you it was a war of liberation. It was a war to liberate your state from oppression. Previously you'd been oppressed by the French, who were the colonial power. Now you're being oppressed by the Americans. It was a just war of self-determination and liberation. And I think that misunderstanding can be quite fundamental to what's going on. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union regarded Afghanistan as a conflict about communism, about having a state on its border that would be a communist state rather than a state where Islam was one of the dominant forces. But if you're an Afghan tribesman in 1986, for you the conflict isn't about that. The conflict is about get the Soviets out, get these Russians out of my country. This is our country, it belongs to us. We will decide how we want to live, not some foreigners who've come here. And I think that misunderstanding, that way of seeing conflicts, is a problem throughout our history. And that feeds into today, is what I'm trying to say. The fact that historically you might have been an ally of India meant that you never said anything about Kashmir, for example, and that makes it difficult to say anything about it now, because you've been quiet about it for the last 70 years, and now maybe that old alliance with India is gone, but it's difficult to suddenly change your mind about something and not be seen to be inconsistent. So anyway, the Cold War rumbled along, and I was absolutely convinced, along with many other people, that it would end in a fiery nuclear holocaust, which would be the end of civilization as we know it. This is why I get slightly annoyed with people nowadays, younger people and me, who complain about climate change and say it's the end of civilization as we know it. Every generation believes that civilization is going to end for some reason. And we had to live under the threat of nuclear war, which seemed a lot more likely and a lot more immediate and a lot worse, frankly. Nuclear war would have been a lot worse than whatever climate change promises. It would have been horrendous. We had to live under that, and we still do to an extent have to live under that. And I'm worried about that. I'm not going to worry about something else, right? I mean, I'm only being slightly serious. I'm also being funny. Yes, climate change is important. We should do something about it. But what I'm trying to say is this: I do not see why any generation deserves to live fear-free, right? And this idea that we've got to do what we've got to do for the children, we don't want them to deal with our mess. That's the job of the children, is to deal with our mess. And then when they'll get older and they'll say exactly the same thing about their children, right? Our children do not deserve to have a completely easy life with nothing to worry about, right? But the Cold War did end without anybody actually firing any nuclear weapons at anybody, without a major war. And at the end of the Cold War, for some people, this sort of meant the end of these alliances because they weren't relevant anymore. They'd been created as part of the Cold War struggle. When the Cold War ended, basically because communism completely collapsed within a space of about 6 months. The Berlin Wall fell, communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, and then communism finally collapsed in the Soviet Union just a year later. Communism folded up very, very rapidly. It turned out that there was very little real faith in communism. Everybody was following communism because they were told to. And what happens in a situation like that is that people just turn around to each other and say, I don't believe in this. And then the other person sitting next to them in their office says, I don't believe in this either. And then the supervisor comes into the office and says, I don't believe in this either. And suddenly the three of them say, well, there's three of us, let's go and tell everybody else now that we don't believe in it. And then you go, the whole factory doesn't believe in communism. They're only doing it because they're afraid. And then the whole state suddenly realizes that they're only actually following communism because of fear. And then eventually it just collapses. But making that first brave, statement, I don't believe in this system, is a brave thing to do. So communism collapsed, and the Russians took the view that they had been made some promises about NATO. Now, these promises are fairly opaque in historical terms. Putin continues to allude to them today, There is no actual evidence that these promises were made. The Russian president at the time was Boris Yeltsin, who frankly was an alcoholic. Everybody knows that, and was not simply an alcoholic in his spare time, was often drunk while on duty. And the idea that the promises were made to him and he's a reliable witness to this is not that realistic. I'm an international lawyer and I like to see things, in treaties and agreements like that. And for the Russians just to say some vague promises were made to them about NATO expansion doesn't really cut it for me. Any more than if you were dealing with a contract and somebody said, well, it's not in the contract, we had an understanding that. You would say, well, why don't you just put it in the contract, right? Now you're asking me to believe that in addition to the contract, there are all these other terms I've got to put in there. No, I'm just going to read the contract. It's the same thing, a treaty is like a contract. Where is the treaty that says NATO will not expand? The Warsaw Pact obviously completely collapsed because there was no need for it anymore, but also none of the members wanted to be in it. They'd all just been forced to be in it in the first place. And for the Russians, they thought, well, the Warsaw Pact and NATO are equivalents, so NATO should really end as well. NATO should end because the Warsaw Pact has ended. But the problem, of course, is that the members of NATO were there because they wanted to be. And therefore, the only way that they would leave NATO was if they wanted to be. And the only way NATO would end was if the member states decided to get rid of NATO. And NATO persisted. So I don't believe there were any promises about NATO being closed as a concern. And I don't believe there are even any promises made about expansion of NATO. So these promises, I just can't see where they actually exist. Now, there is an argument that says, well, maybe they weren't promises, but there was kind of an understanding here. The way you don't say things out loud, but there's an understanding. How exactly that works, I don't know. And certainly the Russians have this view today that NATO should not have expanded because the purpose for NATO to exist was no longer there. The Russians, as they now were, because the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Russians couldn't see any reason for NATO to expand. And they also were using this theory of international relations, which is the spheres of influence thing, which I've alluded to before. The United States has long said that it regards North America, but also South America, as an area that it has dominance over. It's called the Monroe Doctrine, and it goes all the way back to the beginnings of the United States 200 years ago. That, essentially speaking, other powers should keep their noses out of what happens in South America. And the Soviets subscribed to a similar idea, which is basically that, okay, the Soviet Union's collapsed, those former Eastern European states that are under our control have now become democracies, but we should be left to control this area militarily and politically. We are still a large military, we are still a significant force in the world, and you should not interfere in our area, basically. You should keep out of our space. You might have sympathy with that view, but again, the problem I have is this is all rather vague. It doesn't seem to have anything written down anywhere that says, these are what the future conditions of European political and economic and military makeup are going to be. So what happened is that these vague promises and understandings may have existed in the minds of the Russians, but not in anybody else's minds. And then from 1999 onwards, NATO began to expand, and it began to expand into these former communist states. So in 1999, Poland, for example, joined, right? Which is the most economic and military significant of the former, of the states that were supposedly independent states, but really under the control of the Russians. That's the reason why the Warsaw Pact was signed in Warsaw, which is the capital of Poland. So Poland joined NATO, and this NATO expansion continues to this day. The question, of course, and this was the Russians' kind of question, is, well, what is NATO for? If it's a defensive alliance against an enemy that doesn't really exist anymore, then you don't need it, right? And the answer is that NATO really wasn't sure what it was for a long period of time. Between 1991 and 2001, NATO went through a kind of identity crisis in which it didn't seem to really know why it existed. It was expanding, it was clinging to its old beliefs, but the reason for those beliefs to exist didn't seem to be there. And 1991 to 2001 was a period where there were a series of security challenges in Europe, exactly the place where NATO was supposed to be acting, and NATO was not really up to the task. In particular, the former Yugoslavia collapsed, and there was a need for military intervention, but NATO couldn't intervene without the authorization of the United Nations. Now, NATO did do some operations as a result of this. The United Nations authorized the use of force in the former Yugoslavia, and NATO did some air campaigns. NATO's actions have largely been air campaigns, with the obvious exception of Afghanistan, because the NATO states are technologically advanced. And air power, although international law doesn't have anything to say about air power being different from the others, sea power and land power, space power now. But the answer is that air power is an area where the West, and particularly NATO, is dominant. We have much more advanced technology than our enemies, and air power is politically easy to use because it doesn't cause loss of life to your own side. Yeah, you very occasionally a British fighter jet crashes or is shot down over Syria or something like that, but it's very, very rare. Most of the time they don't get shot down, and that means that you can make a huge impact on a campaign without actually risking much in the way of life of your own side. And of course, drones are the ultimate version of this, because in drones you don't risk anybody at all. The guy flying the drone is 3,000 miles away in Lincoln in the United Kingdom, so he's safe. So NATO did act here, and we have this question of NATO as an offensive force because in 1999 in particular, NATO launched what was then its largest military action, which was Operation Allied Force. This was the bombing of the Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia still existed at this time, even though most of the members of Yugoslavia, the other states, had left and pursued their own statehood. NATO began bombing Yugoslavia because of the oppression of the Muslim minority in Kosovo, which was a part of Yugoslavia. The Serb, who are basically Christian majority in Yugoslavia, were oppressing the Muslim minority who lived in the area called Kosovo. And they were ethnically cleansing the area, to use the modern phrase. And NATO launched a bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. And the objective was simple: to impose as much hurt as possible on the government of Yugoslavia. And that would persuade them to stop oppressing the Muslims in Kosovo. And this campaign was eventually successful. It went on a lot longer than everybody thought it would. And there were several problems with it. It turned out to be more difficult to launch the campaign than people thought. But eventually it was successful. The Yugoslav government decided it could no longer put up with being smashed basically every day. In fact, the people of Yugoslavia overthrew the government. And a better government came to power, and the atrocities against Muslims in Kosovo stopped. The problem with all of this is that is not defensive, right? Defensive action, well, there are two problems. Firstly, it's not defensive. Defensive action, which is what NATO says it's for, is where one of your states is being attacked. Well, Yugoslavia was attacking people within its own state, and Yugoslavia was not a member state of NATO. It's very difficult to see how Yugoslavia oppressing its Muslim population is an attack on any of the NATO member states, right? I mean, that's not to say that it's a good thing. Of course, it's a terrible thing that the government of Yugoslavia were doing this. But it doesn't seem to fit in what NATO is designed for, which is, somebody attacks the UK and everybody else comes to the UK's defence. This was something that was happening outside of NATO's territory, literally, in the territory of another state. That's the first problem. The second problem is that even if NATO's action could be justified in some way within the terms of NATO's treaty, you still have to find a justification in the United Nations Charter. And this goes back to those articles I mentioned at the beginning. In other words, NATO can't make the use of force legal. Only international law can do that. And the UN Charter is the best place to find it. Well, the only two categories that could possibly apply would be either the Security Council says NATO's action is legal, or NATO is exercising self-defense. We've already said NATO was not exercising self-defense. And when it comes to the United Nations Security Council, they did not authorize this bombing campaign. The Russians and the Chinese vetoed it, which they're allowed to do. So NATO said, can we have a resolution authorizing this attack? The Security Council said no. And then NATO said, well, let's just do it anyway, right? It was illegal. And so this really does look like NATO is acting as an offensive force. It's offensive in the sense that it's not responding to an attack on its members, and also it's ignoring international law. So if you're the Russians, and for that matter the Chinese, then you're looking at this and going, not only is NATO still there, not only is NATO much bigger and much closer to our borders than it was before, but NATO is just running around doing whatever it likes. And it's not acting defensively, it's acting offensively. So that obviously was a huge concern with NATO, and that I think is a legitimate concern, and to this day I think it's a legitimate concern. The Russians can look at it and say, well, NATO is not always defensive, sometimes it acts offensively. How do we know that it won't be used against us at some point in the future? So that's the main kind of event. I mean, since then, there are a couple of other interesting developments. As I alluded to before, Article 5 had never actually been invoked, but it was invoked. This is Article 5 now of the NATO Charter. It was invoked after 9/11. The NATO Council took this as an example of an attack on a member state and said, this is considered an attack on all member states. As I said earlier, it was largely symbolic. The moment Article 5 was invoked by NATO made no real difference to the events on the ground. NATO did not initially send the military to Afghanistan. The military that went to Afghanistan in September and October and November of 2001 was the United States and those allies who decided to help the United States at that point. But it was very much a United States-led operation. So although British forces were involved, they were there at the invitation of the United States, and they did things that the United States wanted them to do. So the actual toppling of the Taliban was not NATO. Now, after the Taliban were gone, you had to have a security force in Afghanistan. And this was called ISAF, the International Security Afghan Force. And ISAF was a strange operation because it was notionally its own thing, but most of its soldiers were in fact drawn from NATO member states and running under NATO command. So you had a kind of a situation where, technically speaking, it's not NATO securing the peace in Afghanistan, but NATO is actually present, is politically represented, and most of the troops are from NATO. The reason why it couldn't just be NATO doing it was because there were other states there, like, for example, Australia. They sent troops in Japan and South Korea, and obviously these are not NATO member states. But NATO definitely had a large role in securing Afghanistan. And securing Afghanistan, and I know Afghanistan has turned out to be a total disaster, but it wasn't actually militarily that much of a disaster. The disaster was politically speaking. ISAF was actually reasonably successful for several years, and eventually it kind of wound down as people got tired of the commitment. And there was a kind of over-optimistic belief that Afghanistan would stand on its own 2 feet. So that's, again, an example where it's a slightly better example than the one in Yugoslavia. NATO was actually acting under international law because the Security Council had authorized this. But again, if you're the Russians and others, you're going to look at this and say, oh, there's 100,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is an area where, we formally have been involved. We were the power in Afghanistan for 10 years, trying to push our political agenda there. So I think there are some legitimate concerns here for Putin. And then moving it up to date, Putin's talked about his red lines. Obviously, he's looked at NATO and he's worried. Putin is trying to re-establish Russia as a viable force in international affairs. He's concerned with what he sees as the disrespect of Russia, and he sees that in this unrelenting expansion into, in the case of Ukraine, where he said he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was the second largest Soviet republic, and there are ideological and cultural links between Russia and Ukraine, as we discussed in the previous podcast. What's interesting is Putin has looked at all this, and now he's come out with some solid, what he calls red lines. And the first one, there's two basically. The first one is no further expansion of NATO, and in particular not Ukraine. There's also some other candidate states that he doesn't want to join either, but particularly Ukraine, because that would be right up against the Russian border in an area which the Russians have long regarded as their own. He's obviously annexed Ukrainian territory already, and he's talked about the Ukrainian people and the Russian people as being one. There's the insurgency in Donbass. The first thing is no NATO expansion into any more territories, including Ukraine. NATO can't commit to that because membership of NATO, as we said earlier, is voluntary. And NATO's answer is if Ukraine wants to join, then Ukraine can go through the process of joining. It's probable that there will be some kind of settlement here that again is done on the basis of an understanding in which the West says to Putin, look, realistically speaking, we're not going to let Ukraine join NATO. There are various reasons why we're not going to do it. The reasons why we're not going to do it are not the reasons that you've given. We're not doing it because of your concerns, but there are reasons why we don't want Ukraine to join, and therefore our answer and your answer, although they're not based on the same reasoning, are in fact the same answer. So, look, Ukraine's not going to join NATO for 20 years. You're probably not going to be in charge 20 years from now, right? Someone else is going to be president, and you can say that you secured Ukraine from joining NATO. The second group of red lines are the ones that are actually perhaps more interesting because they're completely unrealistic. Putin's talked about essentially withdrawal from NATO of those states that joined after 1997, and he's particularly talking here about Poland and places like that, saying they should leave NATO, or at the very least reduce their military contribution and their military footprint in NATO. This is totally unrealistic. These are states that have been in NATO for over 20 years, and it's one thing to say stop somebody from joining, but it's another thing to say kick people out. You can't kick people out of NATO. I mean states. You can suspend states from NATO. It has happened. Greece was suspended for a period because the problem is that Greece and Turkey are both members of NATO and they fought wars with each other. But generally speaking, it's very difficult just to eject a member without the consent of the member themselves. And we have no intention in the West of doing that. And even if we did have any intention of doing it, we can't without the consent of those states themselves. But this is classic negotiating. You deliberately throw in two things. The one thing is completely unrealistic, and the other thing is realistic. Everybody knows that you can't get the unrealistic thing. So the West could say, well, we're not going to do that, but maybe we'll give you some sort of informal guarantees on Ukraine. And that means Putin can go back to his people and say, well, I didn't get that, but I got this, right? And it'd be the same for the West. We didn't get, what we wanted, but we have secured the existing members of NATO's membership. He's not going to challenge that. So, it's classic negotiating skills. NATO is, like a lot of European organizations, has a kind of institutional dilemma, which is that the logic of these organizations is they have to keep expanding. But there is also a logical end point to that expansion. There is a point at which you can no longer expand, because you're either no longer dealing with geographically contiguous states. In other words, there's no more states in Europe left who want to join. So you're either, either that's the problem, or maybe there are states that are in the right geography, but they're just never realistically going to be capable of joining. Their economies are so different. The corruption involved is so bad. The human rights regimes are so bad. Ukraine, if Ukraine asked to join NATO tomorrow, and NATO completely ignored the Russians, and we're doing it solely on NATO criteria, they would not allow Ukraine to join. There are a whole raft of reasons why, to do with governance in Ukraine. Same with the European Union. Ukraine said, I want to join the European Union. The European Union would say, okay, we can start the process, but it's going to be at least 15, 20 years. So this is the problem, that these institutions have this kind of logic of constant expansion, but what happens when there's nowhere left to expand? And what happens where that expansion comes up against the concerns of a mighty power like Russia? Anyway, that is the potted history and discussion on NATO, and hopefully that was useful.